Well, I'd like to introduce Rich Galliani from the Tile and Stone Council of Northern California. And he's a wealth of knowledge with 40 years of experience in the field. So take it away, Rich.
Thank you, Linda. And thanks everybody from AIA East Bay, Linda, Rachel, Sydney, and Donald for allowing me and asking me to present. I appreciate it. And with that, I think I will turn off my video and go to full screen. Okay, so today we're going to talk about tile installation failures. And I just want to clarify, I have been to the AIA East Bay's awesome presentation that they do on failures. And but this isn't really going to be about, from what I remember of that presentation, there was a lot more forensic information as to why there was a failure. I think it was an exterior deck that we were discussing. And this is really just,
I don't think you're sharing your screen. What do you people
oh, really?
think?
Oh, I'm sorry. Let's see. I thought.
Yeah, it's just your name right now.
Oh,
Rich.
it is?
Yeah.
All right. I'm sorry. Let me see what I can do.
Or maybe you have to have your image up and then.
Oh, there it is. There it is. I apologize. I missed a step in that. How's that?
That's good.
Okay.
Perfect.
Again, sorry about that. I missed that step in the process. So again, I'll just finish up on that thought about, there's my contact information, by the way. We're not talking about catastrophic failures here. I just had, I need to take that screen off. For this presentation, I just defined it as something that would just cause a client to say that's not acceptable. You know, it looks wrong. It doesn't look like what I imagined it was going to look like. And then also there can be some bigger issues. But one of the things that I do as a technical director for Tile and Stone Council is that I go out and do job inspections for the member contractors, the TSC, who essentially are the union signatory contractors in the Bay Area. So it tends to be the larger shops, the bigger projects. But what I really found, this is just my own observation, that it's not necessarily a design deficiency. It's just a lot of times expectations aren't being met. And we'll get into a lot more about that. But I just wanted to be clear that we're not going to be getting super deep into some of the huge issues like that tragedy that just happened in Florida. I mean, that's way beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. So I've come down with this list of the 4 causes of most tile failures. You can take a look at that. We'll get a little bit more into each one of those. It could be one or all of them on a per job basis. First is incompatibility of the specified materials. And you know, when you've got all these products working together, I know we can all agree that there's just been an explosion of products in the tile and stone industry, from sound isolation membranes, waterproofing membranes, both troweled and sheet applied, different types of grout, from epoxy to just basic cement grout, all different types. There's a couple of types of thinset mortar now, besides just your standard. There's also high performance. There's mortar that's specified for large and heavy tile. Some thinsets work better outside. So there's really a lot of things that go into doing a tile installation. And the bottom line is all those products have to be able to work together, because if they don't, you're going to have what I call dueling lawyers, right? At the end of the job, where everybody's pointing fingers and saying, well, you said it would work. Well, no, I didn't, you know. So my solution to that is, I realized that what a small part really, if you're doing a big project, tile is a very small part of that. And I realize that, but there's so many products now that have changed or been upgraded in my time in the tile industry that you almost couldn't be expected to know about all the products, right? So some of the solutions I've come up with when I'm asked by architects or designers to give my opinion on this issue is to just consider a single source installation system, because everything now, the tile companies, or excuse me, the mortar and grout manufacturers are now getting into surface prep, waterproofing, crack isolation, everything, right down to care and maintenance of the products. So if you tend to pancake these products one on top of each other from one company, then you're probably going to get a better warranty. As far as I would check into any newer product. How long has it been in use? Is there any information that you can get? Don't be afraid to ask questions. I know the sales reps can hit you hard with the product, and I'm not knocking them. They have their job to do, but I've been to a couple of jobs where I've been presented with information about a newer product. And when I've taken the time to really dig deep into the technical data that's provided by the company, I don't think it's going to be a successful installation. So if you're being told that by a sales rep, with all due respect to them, I would get that in writing, and I would confirm with other companies that are going to be involved. I mean, if you've got one company that you're using for your grout and another company that you're using for an anti-fracture membrane or something of that nature, I would make sure that those products can play together, because if they can't, again, there's going to be an issue. The next big thing that comes up all the time on jobs that I look at is a lack of proper substrate preparation. And for this, I'm going to use the example of an exterior deck. A lot of times the substrate itself, and when I say the substrate, I mean, like, I'm talking about the plywood subfloor, you would call it, on a deck, that hasn't been pitched to get the water off if any water gets underneath the tile job. So I've indicated here many times existing substrates do not have the inherent pitch required. And what happens is the architect / designer is relying on the tile work to provide water evacuation. And what happens is that's great. I don't mean the tile work, just the tile. I'm referring to any membrane that's underneath that too. But the problem is everything has to be pitched, or it should be, because if that waterproofing fails, the water's just going to sit there. And also, even if the waterproofing doesn't fail, it's going to collect water underneath the tile job. And that can be a problem if you've got a low spot in a corner of a deck or something, with that water just sitting there. That's going to give an opportunity for bacteria growth, for efflorescence, any of those things to start manifesting themselves. You can have where, if there's sitting water there, you can have issues where one portion of the deck looks darker than the other. And the end user doesn't understand, well, that's just water sitting there that hasn't gotten out of there. And if the waterproofing is doing its job, yes, I guess there's not going to be any problem as far as damage to the structure, but it's still unsightly, right? So the solution is to just pitch all exterior horizontal substrates towards water evacuation routes in order to alleviate that as much as possible. Efflorescence, I'm sure if you've done enough tile jobs in exterior, you've had to deal with efflorescence. It's just caused by migration of salts, and it's carried by any water that's in the installation to the surface. And the sources can be any cement-based product. So it can be in your mortar bed, it can be in cement-based grout, it could be in the Thinset. Excuse me. Although the grout and the Thinset manufacturers do a pretty good job of keeping any of that stuff out of their mixes, but they can't promise that there's not going to be anything in there, because it's not. It wouldn't be considered, anything out of the ordinary to have a bit of those products in the mortar mix, in the mortar-based products. Also, your water source. If there's a lot of minerals in the water that you're using for your grout mix or your cement mix or your mortar bed mix, that can cause problems too. But again, it's caused by water in the installation. So if that water is just sitting there, that's potentially could be one of the things that's contributing to the efflorescence. Here's just a little close-up picture that I've seen of efflorescence. And I've made a note here that the mortar manufacturers can get you a list of products that you can use that would help to eliminate that efflorescence. For instance, you could use an epoxy-based grout that has no cement in it. You could use something other than a traditional mortar bed. I'm not going to speak to exactly what those are. Those are kind of trade things that they know more about than I do. But they also have information. The grout companies are very good about providing information as to how to alleviate it, how to deal with it if it does occur. Unfortunately, you see that last line in that slide there. It says efflorescence in and of itself is not considered a sign of a defective installation. Now, I've been in the middle of some heated arguments, or excuse me, conversations with homeowners about that line, but it's true. There's not much you can do about it. It's tough to tell a client, well, it just will stop when it stops, when it's done doing its thing. That's very hard to tell someone, but that pretty much is what the case is. Also, I want to clear up a couple of misnomers about sealers. And tile, thinset, mortar, and grout aren't waterproof. They're not meant to be. So eventually that water is going to get through the installation to the waterproof membrane or whatever is underneath, right? And the sealers that they use today are breathable, and they're meant to allow water vapor transmission in and out of the tile installation. So, you don't want a sealer to lock in the moisture, especially on an exterior, because it's going to be, water, no water, winter water, summer, no water. And it's got to have that ability to let that water come out of the system. A lot of times, homeowners think that sealer is some sort of magical product that the day that the job is done, or, when you come back a week later to seal it, that means that's the way the job's going to look like forever. That's not particularly the case. Being that, let's just take a standard 3x3 stall shower. The fact that you're using that shower probably every day, probably more than once, means that water is going to be constantly pounding against the three walls of the shower and the floor. So it's not unusual that as that water makes its way down to the pan on the surface of the tile, that the grout is going to be darker down by the shower floor and then the floor tile itself. It can tend to look darker. Sealers aren't going to do anything about that. That's just water. There's more water there than there is on the ceiling of the shower or at the top of the ceiling. The top of the walls where they need the ceiling. So that's just kind of the way that is. And again, it's a tough conversation to have with some homeowners, but that's what sealer's for. It's to keep dirt out. It's not to keep water out. So the next step in the process is your floor, and I include walls, and not ready to accept tile, but we seem to have much more issues with floors being ready. So that picture there on the left is a straight edge test. They've taken a 10-foot straight edge and they just put it flat on the floor, and you can see how much of a gap there is. So obviously you're going to have some issues with that floor being ready to accept tile. I like to touch on the fact that the concrete industry and the tile industry have completely different tolerances. Never the twain shall meet, because concrete flatness is measured completely differently than the floor flatness requirements. They come in right after they poured the concrete. They don't measure by walls. They don't measure around posts. So it's a good thing to take a look at the American Concrete Institute's publication, which is simply called Division 3 versus Division 9. They've got some ways to, if you're so inclined, to beef up a slab so that it does less curling and shrinking and warping and all that. But normally, I guess the point of what I'm saying is that when the concrete guy comes in and says, I've done my job, it's within tolerances that were specified. And then it goes to the tile guy, it's usually not acceptable for tile. So that creates certain scenario where here's what the tolerances are for tile from NCA 108 in the handbook. It's 1/4 inch and 10 for all tile less than 15 inches on one side, with no variation greater than a 16th in a 12-inch section, which when measured from the high points in the surface. And it's even tighter for large format tile, which is anything bigger than 15 inches on one side. So you can only get an 8 and 10, or in that should, I missed the 10 part. It should be an 8 and 10. So I'm sorry for all that. That's a mistake on the slide. An 8 and 10 and 10 feet for all tile greater than 15 inches on one side. Again, with no variation greater than a 16th and 24 inches. So it's going to be tough to meet that with a standard concrete pour. Obviously, it's not a big deal on a wood subfloor. They're usually going to be okay. So what's the solution? Sometimes you're going to have to use a traditional mortar bed, which we see a picture of on the bottom here, or we're going to be able to use a self-leveling underlayment on the flowable. I think they're calling it flowable hydraulic underlayment now. It's not called self-leveling anymore. And there was a specific reason for that. Self-leveling implied that it leveled the floor, and it really doesn't. That is not the intent. It's to get it flat, right? I'm sure you've been in situations before where you have an existing building where it's out of level. And, if you've got a huge run for tile, say a 20-foot run, and it's real out of level and it's pitching towards the door, you don't want to level that floor, right? Because you're going to have to use a step ladder to get into the room. So what you're looking for is something, whether it's a mortar bed or this flowable underlayment that allows you to clean up that floor and get it ready to accept tile within those tolerances we just discussed on the previous slide. There's also things that can happen to the concrete when it's being poured. They put accelerants in there, drying accelerants in there. It's very simple. If you'll notice the last line of the slide says water test. You just have to simply walk in, take a little cup full of water and sprinkle it on the slab. And if it doesn't absorb right away, then you probably got some kind of a bond breaker on there. So in the handbook and also in ANSI, it says that the requirements are for setting tile over a slab has to be fully cured, free from all curing compounds, waxy, oily material, dust, and anything in general which may inhibit bonding of the tile. So sometimes if you do have a bond breaker on there, like a curing compound, you're going to have to do some sort of abrasive treatment of the floor. A lot of times what happens though is the tile guy can get stuck, or the flooring contractor can get stuck with prepping that floor, and it wasn't included in the original bid. An allocation for something like running the grinder that you see on the bottom and the top, or using the self-leveling underlayment, the flowable hydraulic cement to clean that floor up. So somewhere in the specs, it ought to make an allotment for that. So that, rather than just using language like prep floor to receive tile, because that can mean anything from just taking a wet rag and getting the dust off it to doing something like this. So you want to make sure that you don't create a scenario with a possible change order having to be issued in the middle of the job. You can also have issues on exterior walls. For me, I've seen scenarios where they've used a sprayer like on the bottom left, and they haven't gotten to the correct depth required for the membrane, is what they were spraying on here, the membrane to do its job. So I included the line here: care must be taken to ensure manufacturer guidelines are followed in order to confirm adequate depth of the material. And I've walked on jobs before where they're doing this, or maybe they're applying waterproofing, like a product called Red Guard, for instance, from Customs. That's very it's a very common product used in installations today. And it never fails that I ask the person that's doing it, do you have a wet gauge? And they're like, what's a wet gauge? And a wet gauge is the product. It's what you use to check to see if you have enough material on the wall or on the floor or wherever you're putting it. So you don't want to guess at this stuff, right? Because that's your waterproofing. And if it fails because you missed a spot, there's going to be a problem. Also, product limitations, right? I mean, if you go putting a waterproof membrane, whether it's sheet applied or spray on, trowel on, whatever, and then you walk away from the project for some reason for 3 months, what's that going to do to the product? Is it going to deteriorate if it's exposed to direct sunlight? I don't know, is there something, is it going to be affected if it's exposed to freeze thaw conditions or something of that nature? That can be a big deal. There it is. Failure to heed guidelines may void the warranties and decrease longevity of the product. So you need to be aware of that stuff. I'm looking to see here. I don't have the ability to pull up the chat feature while I'm doing this. So I'm thinking, Linda, if there's any questions, somebody wants to stop me, should we do it during the presentation or after? It doesn't matter to me.
I think most people can do a chat at the bottom and or unmute themselves and just chime in when they want to.
I'm sorry, I just found the chat feature now to use it. I apologize.
Okay,
So
okay.
yeah, whatever they want to do, I'll keep checking the chat. So,
Okay.
so the next thing is movement joints. I'm surprised by how many jobs I inspect where there's no movement joints, even perimeter joints. The grout is just blocking the tile job in, and there's nothing there at all as far as allowing for movement of the tile. So that's why I put who needs them. You do. This is just a commercial installation at a shopping center, obviously, that I was at, and you can see what's going on there. They didn't have any kind of movement joints, nothing. So Donald had asked, what's the purpose of a sealer? So to go back to that, Donald, the sealer is really to keep like oils and dirts from getting into the job. It's not really to protect it against water, because again, that you've got to have that breathability. And what I usually tell people is that sealers are meant to delay the damage that can be done to a tile job. And what I mean by that, and I'm being a little bit facetious, but if you have a sealed tile job on a countertop in a kitchen and you pour red wine into the grout joints and then you go to Europe for a month, you can have a stain in the grout when you come back. But if you spill that same red wine and you clean it up within 20 minutes or half an hour, there's not going to be any damage. You're going to be okay, because it's the science behind it is beyond my pay level, but they have it to where the water molecules can get through, but the dirt molecules, the oil molecules, things like that can't bust through. So that's the way they do it, and that's why it's still good to have a sealer on a job, but it's not going to do much as far as keeping the job looking like the day it was installed as far as water. Some tiles impervious, yes, but you're most of the time you're talking about like porcelain. Yes, you are correct, but also the grout is really what you're going to be protecting, right? It's more for the grout, unless you're talking about a super porous stone, and those should definitely be sealed. That could do some damage, but again, water's okay to go in and out, but it's everything else. Michael, yes, there is. Is there a square footage threshold at which movement joints are considered necessary? So the shorter answer is, if you look in the back of the TCD handbook, there's a section called EJ 171, and there's I think there's like 13 different movement joints used on jobs. But if nothing else, even if the square footage, which is listed, those numbers are listed in EJ 171, where they should be located when you need them. But if nothing else, you should have perimeter movement joints, because on that, you're going to have a change in plane, right? You're going from a floor to a wall. So you should always leave some breathing room in that. Use a sealer. Use a caulking sealer, or if you're going to be tiling it, you can put like a expansion foam filler underneath, at where the tile itself meets the wall, instead of a caulk joint, because then you're going to be setting a base tile on top of that and grouting in just the face of that. Is there any good sealer for limestone? Yeah, the sealer game has really changed a lot. The tile companies saw the value in preserving their work, obviously. So, and by the way, when I say companies like the grout and mortar manufacturers, I'm referring to Laticrete, Mapei, Customs, Ardex, all those companies. They make a full line of sealer products. Do I have a preference regarding water-based versus oil-based sealer and stone impregnators? Yeah, every single one of those. I would say this, Kurt. All of the manufacturers of the sealer on their websites are going to have, what product gets used with what type of stone, right? Or what type of tile. And I think it's very critical to refer to that. Sealer is not just sealer. Some work better than others. I've always used water-based just because it was easier to clean, but that was just me when I was contracting. There's a lot more information out there now about sealers. And I mean, I've gone to presentations that are 2 hours long just on oil versus water-based. So if you think it's an issue or something critical, then refer to the tech departments, right, of the sealer manufacturer. They're going to be able to tell you, because, you know, a lot of times what you're looking for is you're looking for job specific specifications, right? You're looking for something like, this is what I'm going to do on this job. What do you recommend? That's what you're going to the technical departments for, and making sure that they work. Okay. Not yet. No. There we go. So this is a little video I came across on the internet. This is not staged. This is a real live action video. So again, you know, all I would say is, my goodness, this isn't even outside. So you can expect, I mean, you can imagine what's going on an exterior deck that's getting pounded by the sun in summer and then freezing in the winter. That tile is going to expand and contract. The grout's going, everything has its coefficient of thermal expansion, right? And when you put them all together, you're going to need movement joints, because the Thinset works at a different level. I mean, the Thinset expands and contracts at a different level than the tile and then the grout. And so all those things under the, you know, if there's a membrane underneath there, a mat membrane, that's going to expand and contract at a different rate. So those joints are critical. No, I think we did that already. Now here's the part that architects and designers usually don't like. I say that tongue in cheek, but you read that there because there's so many different ways that you can put a tile job together, that it has to be up to the architect, designer, or the engineer to show exactly and what type of movement joints are going to be used on a job. All that information is available in EJ 171 in the handbook. It's very detailed. It shows you the math of how you get to where you're going. You can give that to your engineering department. In my experience, all of the limits of where and when expansion joints should be used have been over-engineered, if that makes sense. So what I'm saying is, if EJ 171 says on an interior you need to have expansion joints every 9 to 12 feet, that's pretty liberal, you know, and an engineer may be able to tighten up that calculation a little bit, but you definitely need them. Okay, so I have another question about Detramat. Detramat, I've used a ton of it myself, but the one thing that I have to say about Detra is, and we just, it's funny you bring that up, because I was in Orlando yesterday at Coverings, and one of our technical meetings with the ANSI group, and Schluter Detra does not have an ANSI specification yet. So have I had good experience with it? Yes, I did. On a personal level, I used it before. I didn't have any problems with it. I'm sure you could speak to the Detra or the Schluter rep, and they could tell you about some huge jobs that they've done, because I have heard about them. But it doesn't have an ANSI specification, and some of our contractors I know are leery of getting involved with a product that doesn't have any kind of any kind of specifications for its performance, right? Because that's all ANSI really is. It just tells you, you know, if you do it this way, you use this product, and that product is manufactured this way, you should be okay, right? So that's all I can really say about Detra. But I do know the Detra rep if you want to get a hold of him and pick his brains a little bit. It's not a problem. Just more, just kind of sad movement joint pictures. So this is a question that I get all the time from architects and designers. Do I need to bring the existing substrate movement joint up through the finished tile work? normally I say that again, tongue in cheek, it'll ruin my layout. I understand that, but the answer is right out in the handbook. It has to come up through the tile work. It has to be honored, including joints at vertical surfaces. And really, that can be a lifesaver as far as a job. If you have those movement joints, you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. Again, oh boy, what was that? Again, 13 different types of movement joints shown. Question. The concept of bond breaking membranes then, right? I understand what you're asking. It's a great idea, right? If you can use a membrane that provides a little bit of movement, and you can use a thinset that, according to their documents, provide a little bit of movement, and maybe you use a grout that's an acrylic-based grout. Possibly you're going to be having a situation where you can get away with some movement, but I think the thing that gets lost in these conversations about bond breakers is all of those products are only meant to accommodate, lateral movement, right? They don't accommodate up and down movement. So I would be a little bit leery of, hey, if we use products X, Y, and Z, we can accommodate up to a 1/4 inch of movement. It's probably not going to be the case. If you really need something like that, you really want to get into the weeds with the technical departments of the product you're referring to, right? Because for all intents and purposes, yes, they do what they say. I haven't heard of any, unless it's a bad installation as far as the installer. I haven't heard of any big issues with that, with those not working as intended. Okay, another one from Robert. If an exterior tile deck is open on 3 sides, are the movement joints still required? Yes, they are, Robert. And again, that comes into change of plane. You're going to see the language in EJ 171 that says any change of plane requires a soft joint. That's why you have it in the corners of your showers. And technically, you should have it on outside corners too. So according to EJ 171, and as far as, I think I've got a slide in here about the placement of these. I want to see if I can get to that. So that's obvious here, right? Consult the sealant manufacturer, membrane manufacturer. You want to make sure that you're using the right sealant. Refer to EJ 171 for type, location, frequency. Show everything in the drawings. The good installers, the good contractors, tile contractors know that you're going to have to use field drawings, or if you just say we need an expansion joint in this room, let's figure out where. That's going to work too, right? Don't forget to honor all existing movement joints in the substrate. And I put this in as a joke, but I'm serious. Do not leave the location of the movement joints to the discretion of the installer, because you'll have a nice expansion joint running right down the middle of your beautiful design, right? So, and one thing that I did not get into this slide presentation, but I did want to point out is in the last edition of the handbook, 2021, they now are allowing what I would call like zigzag grout joints. Like if you've got a pattern like herringbone or something, and you have to get an expansion joint in that design, normally you would have had to make a straight run through all those tile, right, over the expansion joint, and put in your backer rod and your sealer, and that would kind of wreck the look of your design. So the sealant manufacturers, the grout manufacturers, and everybody have signed off on doing a joint that follows an expansion joint that follows the grout joint in the pattern, if that makes sense. There's pictures of it in EJ 171 in the back of the handbook. I apologize for not having it in the slide, but I think you're clear. I think everybody gets what I'm talking about. I hope. If you don't, just let me know. So now we're on to workmanship issues. Some of the biggest issues that I see when I go on a job is because of construction schedules, the tile contractor, and I'm not I don't want to sound like a whining tile contractor, but, they're getting pushed by the GC. It's close enough. Just get it done. This goes back to the issue that I brought up earlier about substrate prep, right? Where the concrete guy says, I'm good to go. The tile guy walks in when he's ready to inspect it for him because the GC has contacted him and said, we're ready for tile. And the tile contractor shows up with his 10-foot straight edge or his laser and says, this isn't even close. And then the GC says, well, fix it. And he says, well, I'm not going to fix it unless you pay me to fix it. So, there's a point of an issue where, I've seen those things happen on jobs many times, but fortunately, some contractors will proceed. And we all know the rule, you touch it, you own it. So if you go ahead and start tiling over a substrate that hasn't been prepped to ANSI and TCNA standards, you're going to have a problem. You're going to have a problem. And one of the things these guys do is they use Thinset mortar as a leveling compound, and or they use the incorrect notch trowel. Let's jump back quickly to a question that Linda had about, are there any advantages or downside for using an epoxy grout? So there's been a whole thing, in the last, I'd say probably 5 years, maybe 10 years, where everything was just epoxy. And, started to go epoxy 100%, like in commercial bathrooms, schools, locker rooms, things like that. And I think that the nature of that started when architects got tired of grout discoloring, modeled grout, grout failure. And so they just said, you know what, the heck with it. Let's just use epoxy everywhere. Now, I would say that in the last 5 years, the grout technology has changed so much that you may not need an epoxy grout in some of the places you're currently speccing them. There's now currently an ANSI classification for high performance cement-based grouts. And those grouts have color uniformity, whether it's batch 1 or batch 1000. And that was never the case with previous cement-based grouts. They have more additives in them, and they hold up a lot better to long-term use in a commercial installation. There's also acrylic-based grouts, 1 part grouts, urethane-based. So if it's and epoxy grouts, there's the installation of epoxy grout normally used to be real tough for a tile installer. So the contractors tended to up the price as far as their labor for doing epoxy. That's changed a little bit because epoxies have gotten a lot easier to work with. But I think it's fair to say that you may not need epoxy in all the installations that you're maybe currently using it. And I would suggest talking to, again, the grout and mortar manufacturers, architectural reps, to see if it's really necessary. So back to workmanship issues. If you start using Thinset mortar as a leveling compound, you're going to be into trouble. And I'm going to show you in these following slides what I'm talking about. So this is the job. This is one that they said was ready for tile. I want to touch a little bit on that first. So this came to me from a tile contractor on the East Coast. So that's ready for tile, huh? Very interesting. I don't think I would be putting my name as a tile contractor on that, right? This is a job inspection, just for some perspective. This is a tub surround with a piece of protective plywood over the tub itself. And I just wanted to point out a couple of the design things that I saw on this. So this is going to be an installation where they're going to come in with a dent shield, hardy backer, whatever they use, right? It's probably not going to be a mud installation. They're not doing that much anymore. So the hardy backer installer or the dent shield installer is going to come in, and all the places, let me see if I can. So all this area right here where you've got these screws sticking out on this backing, which is probably there for, shampoo niches or whatever. I'm sorry, not shampoo niches, for grab bars or something like that, that you're eventually going to put in that. and all these screws and this sheet metal are going to bow out the dent shield when you put it down. So the studs may be perfect, maybe within industry tolerance, but when they go and do that, those little pan head screws are going to kick everything out, and you're going to have a bow in the wall as you sight down it. So now that has to be fixed. So the only way to fix something like that would be to shim out, to put shims on the studs so that it came out so that it's still flat. Also, I'm kind of surprised there's no triple stud right there. I mean, that's a pretty big span for tile to run on its own. So that made me a little nervous when I saw that. But these are all just the things that come up on a job where, hey, somebody's going to have to pay for that. But again, if you have a tile setter that goes ahead, or a tile installer that goes ahead and just starts slamming tile on a bowed wall, things are going to happen. It's not going to meet the industry standard. So I'm just reading this. I don't know if you can see that. Can you guys see the chat on the screen? It's so that I know any thoughts, reservations on it. Any thoughts, reservations on installing exterior wall tile to dense glass with a bond coat in lieu of a metal lath over cleavage membrane with scratch mortar bonds coat? Value engineering opportunity. It all comes down to if the parties involved will sign off on it. What I mean is, yes, the grout manufacturer, or not the grout, the mortar manufacturer is going to say, yes, I'm comfortable that your tile is going to stick to the wall, in that sort of an application. You may need to use X, Y, and Z thinset mortar, whatever they tell you to do. But I never think it's a bad idea that if you're doing something that's a little bit out of the ordinary, that you get it confirmed by the people involved, right? I'm sure this has been done. I mean, this doesn't look like any application that would, make me run for the hills, right? It's just, you're not putting the mortar bed on there. But again, you want to make sure that, because the contractor, somebody has to be responsible for the job. That's just the bottom line. So check with the technical reps to make sure that they're good with that, and then you should be good to go. So this is more information. I apologize if I'm getting into the weeds. It's not really an architect's job to know how thinset mortar gets applied, but I've just seen so many failures on jobs because of just a complete lack of knowledge on the part of the installer to know how to put the tile in. And it's just the bottom line. And if I could just get on my soapbox for a minute, we tend to see this more on jobs where a flooring contractor has been hired, where you've got guys that one day they're putting in linoleum and the next day they're putting in tile. The swirl marks that you see are fine, that you'd see on, with the notch trowel on an installation, that's fine for soft tile, but it's not, that's not the way a tile installation works. It's not the way you set tile. Proper directional tiling, embedding the tile, that allows the air to escape from the edge. So you've got directional troweling. When you take the tile, you embed it, you push it around, push it forward, backward, left, right, so that the ridges collapse. And what happens is all along here where I'm running the pointer, that allows the air to escape from underneath that tile. That avoids air pockets. It creates the bond that makes the tile stick to the subsurface. You've also got to burn that thinset with the flat side of the trowel, that side of the trowel, into the substrate that you're attaching the tile to. So you burn it in, and then you notch it, and then you make sure the back of your tile is clean, and then you set that tile in there, put it in, embed the tile, and you should be good to go. So we just have pictures here. This is a tile that's been properly embedded. They smeared enough for 2 tile, whatever, 1.5 tile. They put the tile down, they pushed it back and forward, front and back. And that's what the trowel ridges are supposed to look like, right? They flatten. This over here, you can see how easy this tile came up. What this guy did was he smeared it, in a couple different directions. You can see some, different direction troweling here. So that was incorrect. But then what he did was when he set the tile, he saw that the floor was still going to be uneven. So he spot bonded. He just took globs of Thinset and threw them into the mortar and then hoped that by pressing this tile in, that would make everything level. Well, this goes back to what we were talking about with proper substrate preparation. If this tile had been fixed, this is a large format tile, so it's an 1/8 and 10. If this substrate had been prepped to an 1/8 and 10 tolerance, then all you would need to do is come in with a 3/8 inch notch trowel, directional troweling, put the tile down, squish it in, let the air escape, and you're gonna have a flat job. So what happens is when you do things like this with spot bonding, this Thinset is all gonna dry at a uniform rate. So if you have a tile that's got, a 1/2 inch of Thinset in this blob and 3/4 of an inch Thinset in that blob, and varying in all these, what happens is when it dries, the tile's going to be cockeyed. It's not going to just suck down to the floor like it would if you were just tight to the notches and tight to the substrate. This is a job I just kept some pictures of when I was a tile contractor. A lady said, "Oh, my tile sounds hollow," so I went there, and you can see it's just a residential bathroom, but I popped one tile up and the whole floor just came up. There was no expansion joints around the perimeter. There didn't need to be any interior. It was, within the range of needing them. But you can see that the Thinset is completely dried. It's put in with swirl marks. It did not bond to the back of this porcelain tile. Sometimes with porcelain tile, it may be necessary to burn some mortar into the back of the tile itself, besides burning it into the substrate, troweling it, and then setting the tile. The way you can tell that is every 5 or 6 tile, as you're setting tile, you just pop one up and make sure it's bonding. If it's not, you may have to go back and start back buttering the tile. That's usually not necessary with a clayback tile, but sometimes it is with porcelain, because there's this white powder that gets put on the back of the tile during the firing process, and it can still be on the tile when it gets to the job. So a good tile setter is going to know that. He's going to clean it. He's going to have his helper or finisher clean that before it gets in his hands to be installed. So, but if you didn't know that, that could be an issue for an installer. Okay. Lippage. That's another big one that I deal with all the time on my inspections. This comes right out of the TCNA handbook, and it shows what industry tolerances are. Now, it's very important to note that these numbers right here, so if you have a 6x6 or an 8x8 quarry tile with a 1/4 inch grout joint, you can have a 1/16 of an inch allowable lippage. That's, industry standard. That is an acceptable amount. With other tile, the bigger the tile, it drops down like a porcelain or pressed floor tile with 1/4 inch grout. You drop down to you get a 1/16 also. For these, it's a 32nd. But that's in addition to the inherent warpage created in the manufacturing process for tile, which means ANSI A 137.1. So ANSI 137.1 is a specification for manufacturing tile, the US standard, and it has, I think it's got about 5 or 6 tables that refer to the warpage, tile, whether it's bowed or cupped or whatever, and it tells you what that warpage is. So when I go to a job and they say there's lippage, how much lippage is there, right? We have a question. Should you always sometimes dampen tile before you set it? No, that's not true anymore, Linda. That was true when you had a clayback tile that was being set with pure mortar, which is the way we did it when I came in back in the 70s, but that was like they did it that way forever. But there's no reason to have that extra that extra moisture if you don't need it, right? It can get into the tile, it can get into the grout. It just slows down the curing process for the mortar. So I would say that's a no. I've got a couple pictures here of lippage because I want to talk about how you can deal with it, right? So there's a wall with probably looks like a 12 by 24 tile, whatever, but you get that lippage issue, you get that issue right there with the downlighting. There's a floor. I would say this is probably an 8 by 24 tile, maybe something like that. So what do you do when you're presented with that? Well, here's some of the jobs that I've measured lippage at. That's a lot of lippage in that left picture. You're not getting away with that one, my friend. So here's the solutions. You may have to widen your joints. Now this is a line here that a lot of architects that I've spoken to weren't quite aware of this. And by the way, I mean, I think the TCD handbook's like 457 pages. So why would you be familiar with all of it? I mean, unless you have a person dedicated in your office just for that, which is ridiculous. So the handbook says that a grout joint should be a minimum of 3 times the actual size variation of the tile as measured in the field. So some of that information you can get from the ANSI book, and you can, a tile contractor can look at a tile when it's spec'd. You can go to the spec sheet and say, oh, okay, this tile is going to vary at least a 16th, plus or minus a 16th of an inch. Now that can get pretty hairy when you're in the field, when an architect specifies a 16th of an inch grout joint, and you've got tiles that vary by that much, right? So a 16th of an inch variation is going to call for a minimum grout joint of 3/16. If you're using a large format tile, the industry says now that the most you ought to go is a 33% offset instead of 50% where you're using a large format tile. Anything bigger than 15 inches on any one side. It can make the job look a little bit busier, but it's gonna knock down the lippage issue, right? It's gonna deal with that a little bit. I put mock-ups in red because mock-ups are very critical, in my opinion, to all tile jobs, right? Because you can deal with issues like lippage. And when we get into lighting, you can see you can deal with your lighting issues too if you do a mock-up, right? And I like to say that it provides the end user a context for what's acceptable in the installation, right? So you may be set on 16th of an inch grout joint, but once you see the mock-up and say, look, that's just not possible. And it doesn't even have to be a hard mock-up. It could be, what I call a soft mock-up, no grout or anything. It'd just be a dry layout, on the job site on a piece of sheetrock or something, a flat surface where you can lay some tile out and see what the tile is doing. And it's critical when they say this line here about tile as measured in the field, right? Because even though you're going to get some information from a tile technical data sheet, you always have to check the tile as it comes to you in the field, because that's where you're going to find the problem. If there's going to be one, you're not going to know it until you get the tile in the field. I've actually had jobs where we've stopped the job and sent the tile to the Tile Council of North America to see if it meets ANSI standards. Because if it says, the tile says, okay, it's not going to vary much more than X, Y, or Z, and you find tile that's exceeding those specifications from ANSI, it may be a bad load of tile. You send it back to TCNA, they'll test the tile and tell you whether it meets industry tolerances or not. But I'll give you some free advice. It's always a better idea to do that before the tile installation starts, right? Because once it's on the wall, now you're going to have a problem if it doesn't meet ANSI standards. Now what? And that whole doesn't meet ANSI standards really puts the tile contractor in a bit of a bind, because I've been on jobs before where this has been an issue, and the tile contractor says to the tile manufacturer, now wait a minute, you sent me a box of tile that says meets ANSI A37.1 specifications for manufacturing tolerance, and it's got a standard grade seal on it. Why is it my job to test this tile to see if it does in fact meet that? So that can get a little ugly on job sites. Hopefully it doesn't come to that. This is the next big thing that we deal with a lot. I don't know when wall wash lighting became popular. I'm not really not much of an expert on that, but it's definitely popular. And from the handbook, it's gotten so bad in our industry that TCNA had to put some information in the handbook regarding that. So I don't need to read this to you, but what's going to happen is if you do that, that is going to accentuate all the negative things that can happen with a tile. So let's say you've got a tile that's a little bit warped on an edge within factory tolerance. That's going to be a big deal when you've got wall wash lighting, because it's going to create a shadow and there's not much you can do about it, other than change your lighting. I've got some examples here that I've taken from jobs. This is one that's actually just from a tile dowel. excuse me, from a Dow tile handout that they have. So you've got your 2x2 mosaics on a wall. The left has wall wash lighting. The right, they pulled it away. And by the way, 24 inches off the wall is where it seems, you know, that's about the magic number to where wall washing seems to go away, where all these shadow lines and all that go away. This is a video. One of these is a video. This was, oh, I thought I had a video on one of these. There we go. So this is on the right. That's wall wash lighting. Okay. But as you get away, watch now as I make the turn and go down the wall that doesn't have wall wash lighting. See how you get away from the wall wash lighting and it starts getting better? You don't see it, right? All that tile is within industry standard. All of it was installed within industry standard. Same installer, same tile, different wall, different lighting. I thought we had I could have sworn this was, I guess not. My apologies. There we go. Same issue, right? That's with the lights off. So that's definitely a big one on jobs. This one speaks for itself. Same room, same wall, down lighting on versus down lighting off. So this is back to installer error, spot bonding. Scourge of the qualified tile installer. What is spot bonding? Spot bonding is like I showed you back in that picture where they take globs of Thinset, sticking around the four corners of the tile, maybe six if it's a large format, it's six globs, couple in the middle. Why is it done? It's done to save time. It's done to make a bad floor better, but it really isn't. And just for the record, are there any situations where it is acceptable to use this method? Yeah, spot bonding itself is acceptable, but this is an exterior application and they're using epoxy. Epoxy doesn't shrink. You know what I mean? So you're not going to have the issue of the shrinkage that you would before. And it's only on walls. So you can see that's a wall method. So they don't use it on floors because you're not going to have any issues with people walking. Right? Good example of what not to do. This is a spot bonded shower, completely failed. The tub surround, the picture on the right, same thing. I don't know what that guy was thinking. I don't even know if he's a true tile installer, but that's not acceptable. I don't think anybody would argue with that. These are some, this is from my Hall of Shame. So up here, figure 9, what is that? A 1/2 inch gap between the tile and the substrate. So what do you think is going to happen to that tile if it was an exterior application in a freeze thaw area and the water gets behind there, right? It's going to pop off the wall. Same thing here. This is a floor. I don't know what this guy was thinking, but I do know this. You go rolling a metal cart over that, or maybe a pointed shoe heel, and it's going to pop. And it's also going to sound hollow when you step on it, walk on it. And more importantly, these marks may not go away. I can't guarantee that they would go away. This little beauty over here, true story. I was just sitting in my truck one day waiting to do an installation, and I had the window down. And I heard a noise, and I thought, well, that kind of sounds like tile falling off a wall. And I looked over, and this is what I saw. This is from a high rise in San Francisco, and I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. I won't say where it is, or, you know, but the point is this tile was spot bonded. It never bonded to begin with. So that tile is going to fall off the wall eventually. And if you look closely here to where I've got the laser, all those dots, you can see that's where the guy put his thinset mortar on the back of the tile and plopped it on the wall. They're holding moisture, right? Like you would expect them to do in San Francisco, but that's all moisture signifying where the dots are on the tile. And this installation went way up. I mean, I remember it being at least 8-10 stories high. So I wouldn't want to be around when that tile started coming off the wall. Question. just an opinion, Donald, is it necessary to stipulate that spot bonding is not allowed on the job? Yes, and I would also say that you know, any information you're going to get from the, you know, the TCNA handbook is going to talk about spot bonding. You can find it. You can find documentation about why spot bonding should not be done. It's not a recognized method, but I don't think that's a bad idea. You know, maybe even providing the information regarding spot bond to the installer. So there again, there's the issues that spot bonding can lead to. I mean, those are the big, and that's tile coming off the wall, right? If any of those things happen, or chips. You know, I believe that an architect who walks on a job and sees that can call a timeout. That's just my opinion. But you're just setting yourself up for I mean, I realize that the architect isn't, it's not going to be the architect's problem, but you know, I like to say about jobs that if one goes down, we all go down, which means, you know, I've driven by jobs before where I've said nailed it, and then I've driven by jobs where I said, that one kind of leaves a rough taste in my mouth, you know, because of some issue that happened on a job. So how do you get away from that? Well, you got to know how to set tile, right? You can't just have a guy that one day he's running carpet or, you know, VCT or whatever, and now he's a tile guy. It's not as easy as it looks. There's a lot of stuff that goes into substrate prep that you need to know. Qualified labor is a term that we use, and you know, I want to just say that I'm not implying that union trained tile installers are the only ones that know what they're doing. That's not true, right? I mean, yes, we have a 4-year program, and yes, our guys are trained in proper techniques, methods. They're always going back for updating, you know. But if you look in the TCNA handbook, there's a section on qualified labor, and it refers to some of the techniques that you can use to find out whether your installer that bids a job meets certain criteria. I know that the National Tile Contractors Association has a program called 5-Star Contractor. You can look into that. Also, the Tile Contractors Association of America, which is more the union contractors in the United States, they have the Trial of Excellence. It's tough standards to get those you know, qualifications, and you can put that in your bid that the contractor has to be either 5-star or Trial of Excellence, and that will weed out a lot of the low bid, the low ballers. You know, of course, you have to check on it once you specify it, because I've heard of some jobs where, you know, oh yeah, these guys are qualified. It turns out that they're not. So be aware of that. In conclusion, my thing is always start out with the latest edition of the ANSI in the handbook, right? They do change. I've got a line here, but remember, these are only minimum design standards. The mortar grout manufacturer's technical department are a good place to start looking for information. Again, it's all about the warranty, right? Just so you know, the handbook is published yearly, and it's the odd years when they put in additions and revisions. So if you have 2019, 2020 isn't really that big of a deal. There's no changes. 2021, the current one, does have some changes in it. You can get those in bulk for your office, and it also comes in digital formats. Unfortunately, the one thing I will say about the digital formats is, if you're not aware of this, but TCNA is they're very touchy about cutting loose their information from the handbook. So you're not allowed to make copies of any of the methods or anything from the handbook. If it does, it says, you know, this is a copy, or there's a big watermark on it, is what I'm getting at. So, you know, that's that. If you do need anything, this is the grand finale. Believe it or not, this is a picture of a completely upside down installed tile, grouted and everything. Looks great. He's got no lippage, no downlighting issues, but I guess somebody forgot to tell him that the shiny side goes up. So I'm sorry to see that's happened. That's not a good one. My presentation sources from ANSI in the handbook, there's again is my contact information. And please note that if you or your firm need a copy of the current TC&E handbook, or a couple for your office, or ANSI manuals, please reach out to me. I'll send you copies. Of course, I've got other presentations that I can do for your firm related to tile installations. One of the current popular ones is the real big panels, the big porcelain panels that are like 5 foot by 10. Those are getting popular now. So I do have something on that if your firm so desires. So with that, I'll turn it back to Linda. If anybody has any questions or anything, I can still answer.
I have one more question, and there was a job that I did actually years ago, but it was with a green marble, and only found out it wasn't too late, but it was right before installation that you needed to use a special backing and mortar mix with it. Otherwise, it was going to warp. Is there any other product besides green marble that you have to watch out for? Oh, Rich, you're muted.
There we go. Yes. I would be the agglomerates, unless it's a true stone or a porcelain tile. If it's something that's they take a bunch of, leftovers and kind of crush them and put them all together with epoxy and resins and all that, you may want to take a look at that. I failed to mention that there's a sister book that we call, I would call it, from the TC&E handbook. That's called, it's from the National Stone Institute. They used to be called MIA, the Marble Institute of America. And that's got, they have their installation guides too. It deals somewhat more with slab type material. The tile is done by us, and they do this, they cover the slab part, but that's also a very knowledgeable catalog of what issues can be with certain stones, right? Most of the mortar manufacturers will tell you, oh, if that's the type of material you're using, you need to use epoxy or whatever, right? I'm sure that's what they told you to do, was either coat the back of the tile or use pure epoxy, right? Because anything with water is gonna, it's gonna curl.
One other question.
Any other? Oh, sure.
Are there stone products that alone will cause efflorescence, even if you've used all of the proper installation methods and grout?
Well, it's not really efflorescence, but kind of related to that. Have you ever seen a slate job where the iron in it leaches out and you get that orange dripping that's coming? I'm thinking of an exterior app. I see Claudia nodding her head. So, that can happen too. You have to remember that it sounds funny, but it's not man-made. You really don't know what it's going to do. That they do have the testing procedures to make sure that, it is what it says it is. But in my opinion, to say that there's chicanery in the stone industry is kind of ridiculous, but there are some bad actors. We had some stuff that was coming across from, I think it was from Turkey. And basically what they were doing was they were taking white slabs and putting almost like a, in air quotes, shoe polish on, like a black shoe polish. And it looked great. But once they put a sealer on it at the end of the job, it just completely melted away, and you were back. It was horrendous. So, if you make sure you're dealing with reputable dealers, right? The people that and then if it's a huge job, specify that it should meet testing criteria, which again, that's all listed in the MIA NSI handbook.
And is there any way, you said that using very hard water in a mix could cause problems? Is there any way other than specifying that you use some kind of bottled water or tester
Right,
water?
I know what you're, sure. And, I would say this, I don't know too much about, the mortar and the grout manufacturers are really like a treasure trove of information about topics like this, because they're going to have done all the testing, and I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere in their data set they have criteria for water, if that makes sense. Like, hey, send us the water, we'll test it, and we'll say, yeah, there's too much X, Y, and Z in it, I wouldn't use it. Does that make sense? I mean, they would be the only source of how. I mean, there's nothing that I know of off the top of my head,
Okay.
that says, yes, you can use this water. Most of it, I'm sure, is fine. But I do know from past experience that every once in a while, it can be the water that's not helping the situation. So, Donald?
I have a question about a comment you made about not using Thinset to flatten a wall. And and then you showed a picture of some metal studs and a tub surround. And you talked
Yes.
about the screws that would cause some bulging and depressions in the wall. And then I go to my own experience using Durock on a wall. And Durock is kind of like wallboard in the sense that it's got two edges that taper in. And you're supposed to go back and then put kind of a fiberglass type tape on that and
Yes.
set it. So in that kind of installation, it's kind of natural to take a long metal straight edge with Thinset and flatten everything out before you do it. And so wouldn't they have done that on that tub? Or maybe you could just explain a little bit more about the dangers of trying to flatten things out with Thinset.
Well, I would say this. So 9 times out of 10, probably nothing's going to happen, right? But I do know that if it got into, if there was an art, say a discussion or forensic going back into that job and looking, they're going to, the Thinset manufacturer is going to say, look, ANSI says that. Now I'm not sure about these exact numbers, so don't quote me. But what I'm getting at is there's a uniform thickness that you want to see in a mortar bed. Okay, so if that mortar bed exceeds that thickness, then the mortar manufacturers are probably going to cry foul, or at least technically they should. Now, there are products that you can use that can straighten out a wall too. And it's just a matter of, okay, if you want to do it by the book and you want to make sure you're covered warranty wise, then you should use that wall prep material rather than Thinset. And I completely understand your point, and more than likely it's not going to happen. I mean, the Thinsets are good, right? And there's a Thinset material, or excuse me, a Thinset classification now called LHT. I can't remember what the ANSI number is, but it stands for large and heavy tile. And the Thinset manufacturers claim that material can be installed up to 3/4 of an inch thick, or whatever their claims are, right? So, you're kind of, we've, as an industry, the tile people have said, well, no, wait a minute, you're telling us that you got to have a uniform thickness or we're violating ANSI, and yet you're making these products that can go on that thick. What's the deal? So it's kind of a gray area. And I doubt very much that, I think really what I was just pointing out is that you don't want to see that in the wall, right? That's going to have to be dealt with.
And normally, if you're flattening out the wall, what you're doing is you're going to flatten it and you're going to let it dry. And then you're going to go back and put on the Thinset to set the tile. So the thickness of the wet stuff might be normal, but I suppose if you drilled a hole through the place where you flattened it out a bit, it might be larger.
Well, and now I'm playing devil's advocate, but believe me, I actually heard this conversation. That exact scenario was presented to the Thinset manufacturer. And he said, okay, so now you're telling me that you're setting tile with Thinset on Thinset. You're not supposed to do that. I mean,
I see.
You know what I mean? That's a kooky explanation, but it's, to me, again, I hate to keep beating a dead horse, but it's all about the liability. And tile contractors are terrified that if we don't follow it to a T, we're going to get the finger pointed at us and we're just going to buy ourselves a new job, another job, right? So you kind of have to follow the rules, the ANSI and the handbook when you're doing that. Am I saying that there aren't guys who go outside that and it still holds up? Absolutely. I mean, I'm not,
one more question. architects know that there are some projects where they tend to be at greater risk. So a lot of architects will not, for example, do condominiums, because you showed a picture of 2 lawyers in the beginning of your talk, and those guys are waiting around for architects on condominiums. Are there project types in the tile industry that excite the lawyers?
I think you just covered it. You know, it's mostly anything with water, right? Anything with water, especially water over a living space. You know, so our guys, I mean, again, the firms that I deal with mostly, they're running like, and things aren't quite up, and I'm assuming it's the same for you guys. Things aren't quite up to where they were, but they're running like 150, 160 guys, and they've got, you know, the financial backing to take on a project like that, right? I think you get into issues where tile guys don't want to touch anything where they've got, I'm not even really familiar too much with it, but you know, the wraparound insurance policies and things like that, where one sinks, you all sink, is what I understand from the contractor's point of view. And then there's other things that, you know, it's just a tile contractor is going to look at it and say, you can't do that. That's just not a good idea. And I'm not comfortable doing that, even though the sales rep says, yes, our product says you can do that. You know, our guys don't like to get involved with newer products that don't have a track record, if that makes sense. You know, I mean, if there's not 5-10 years worth of data and testing, they may shy away from it and say, nope, I'm going with the old tried and true method, because I don't want to be, you know, I don't want to be the guinea pig for when this thing has to last for 10 years for liability purposes, and at 8.5 it falls off the wall, right?
And Rich, one more question. It came from Robert Peterson.
Oh, sure. I didn't look at
Oh,
Mhm.
Are protector boards and drain mats typically used above membranes?
No, I mean, usually, I mean, if you're talking about on top of a membrane, well, I know like Schluter makes a product that's both. You know, if you're going to use it on an exterior, it's a membrane that's a drain mat, right? I mean, you don't have to have any protector boards unless the product calls for it, right? I mean, at some point you're going to have to get onto it, but I've seen some products where they do require it. You know, here's your membrane, and then we want you to put this on top of it before you put your mortar bed. I understand that what you're talking about, Robert. And you know, if it says to do it, you got to do it, right? Because that's the other thing about the handbook that some people don't realize, and it's that the manufacturer can always overrule what the handbook says. So if you have, you know, something that says don't do this in the handbook, and a rep has a product, they say, well, we can do that, and you know, if you do that this way and you install it this way per our instruction manual, then you're going to be okay in your warranty. Then that's totally okay with the handbook. The handbook realizes that. We like to say that the handbook is just a starting point for your installation, because there's so many different varied type of information, you know, that's out there on products and everything.
Well, unless anybody has more questions for
I think
Rich.
Barry had one. Did you have one, Barry?
Yeah, if you're an architect and you go out to a site where you have an exterior deck over habitable space, you're looking at it at the subfloor phase, and you notice that you're a little worried about the slope of that plywood, and you take your level out there or whatever, and you see that it's like, flat in some areas, and maybe at the best 1/8 of an inch to a foot in other areas. What do you do as an architect?
Well, you know, I think that's just one of those judgment calls where, you know, I like to say, and again, this sounds a little facetious, but it's like, how's that going to sound in court? And I didn't mean that directed at what you just said to me. I just mean like, it's very hard to get up in court when, you know, they're holding the book up and saying, well, this is what the book says, and we put a level on it, and you didn't do what the book says. It's kind of like discussion over as far as liability, you know. And you know, the other thing, when I pointed that out, Barry, about pitching the deck and all that, I also realized that well, okay, what are you supposed to do? Design a whole drainage system for the subfloor? It's, you know, also, I mean, you know, I guess the point I'm really just trying to make is be very leery of any standing water on a deck, right? You know, I don't know. I really don't know how to answer that other than to say, follow the book. You know,
Or
if it doesn't meet it,
what about like in a shower where you use some kind of a pre-float where you put down a sloping mortar bed to create the slope on top of the substrate?
agree. I mean, so one of the last jobs that I did before I got this job, it was a deck in Marin County over an exposed space. And what we did was we had a plywood surface it was actually, it kind of had a dip in it, Barry. You know, there was it kind of lipped up at the edge of the structure. And we knew that. So what we did was we put a membrane, the roofer put a membrane right over that plywood substrate. And then we came in with a pitched mortar bed, a reinforced pitched mortar bed, but we also put topical waterproofing on that mortar bed.
On top of the mortar bed.
Correct. You know, like a product like Red Guard. I hate to keep pitching Red Guard, right? Because in that way, when the water makes its way through the tile and grout and Thinset, it's going to hit Red Guard.
Okay. I remember the details. Tell me if I'm wrong about this, but the old Thinset mortar system, they would show the membrane below the mortar. Is that correct?
I thought it was below. The old school, I thought was below.
Old
You know,
school.
it was like a membrane, hot mop membrane and then tile. But you're right. You could do it. You know, you could do it either way, right? I
But
mean,
no, the waterproofing on top of the sloping Thinset mortar bed makes a heck of a lot more sense. Yeah.
that's what I did.
Yeah.
And it was bomb proof, right? You had double layer. And it was nothing. I mean, those rollable membranes, come on, what's that in terms of turning out the job? You know, so.
Well, thanks everybody for coming, and especially thanks to you, Rich, for putting on
Absolutely.
the program.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Please reach out anytime. More than happy to answer your questions or whatever.
What were the last 4 digits of your phone number? It just went off as I was writing it down.
Oh, it did. It's 415-308-5325.
5325. Okay, good. Thank you. Very helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Thanks,
great.
everyone. Appreciate your
Thank you.
time
Thank
too.
you. Bye
Take care.
now.